Boy, it always amazes me, impresses me really how quickly you guys come to order. That's really terrific. I was prepared to have to wait another minute or two, but I share your anticipation of getting this next session underway with these all-stars. So this is another keynote conversation, and I'm going to leave it to Mike O'Reilly to actually introduce the panelists and not steal his thunder, but I do want to say a word about Mike O'Reilly, since he probably won't do it himself. Well, number one, I'm very proud that Mike is an adjunct senior fellow at Free State Foundation. And of course, one of the important things he's been doing is a podcast, TMT with Mike O'Reilly. And I'm embarrassed to say, when we first started talking about it, I had to ask what TMT stood for, which I should have known. But the thing about Mike that I want to say, because it relates to a lot of the discussion we've had here today about reforms in different areas of communications law, and of course we've talked about the FTC, but when Mike O'Reilly was a commissioner at the FCC, one of the areas, one of his missions was to do a lot of procedural reform of the FCC's rules, and also substantive reform.
Not a good, that did me.
In other words, he was a leader in regulatory reform, which of course at the Free State Foundation has been an important part of our mission. By the way, of course, he was doing it with Chairman Ajit Pai's encouragement, I'm sure, and collaboration and colleagueship there. But to me, that was a distinguishing mark of Mike's career. So in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to him, but I'm not going to walk away before I congratulate former Chairman Ajit Pai on his newest position. On April 1st, he's going to become the new president, CEO. There may even be a third part to that title, over at CTIA, and anyone that's bold enough to start a new position of that importance on April Fool's Day, really, I mean, only Ajit would do that. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn over to Mike, and I thank all of the panelists for being here today, all of you.
Well, welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. You're all part of the audience. My guests are, I think I said this last year, my guests need no introduction. These are well-known institutions within this town, and I'm really excited about the conversation we're about to have. But I do a brief, you've seen the bios are in the pamphlets that Randy had presented, but I'll do a brief announcement, and then we'll just go from there. For clarity purposes, each panelist will be providing their own personal views and does not speak in any capacity for their current employer or the administration. Is that fair? Good. All right. To my immediate left is Commissioner Melissa Holyoke, who's a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission. Next to her is Nathan Simonton, a commissioner at the FCC. And next to him is, of course, Ajit Pai, former chairman, former commissioner, an all-around great guy, former at the FCC. So let's start with an easy one, and then we'll work our way into some harder material. You're all very accomplished individuals. What got you into public service? I mean, it's not an easy subject, and it's not always rewarding. It can be. But what took you into that direction, and where you find yourself now?
Where do you want to start?
I'll start right with you.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Free State. I'm thrilled to be here. Very excited to be with you all. I'm sure some of you are wondering, why is the FTC commissioner on a panel with all the FCC folks? It's because they're really worried that the Mormon mom's going to drop the 4-letter words, and they need you all to bleep me out. But no, I'm thrilled to be here. Public service has always been important to me. After a stint at Big Law, I worked in public interest for quite some time, for 8 years, doing protecting consumers from unfair class actions, but also protecting them from federal overreach. In fact, you might not know this, but I had a DC Circuit case against the FCC, and I won. In the new challenging, well, thank you. This was the new charter merger, so you'll like this.
Oh, yes, I do remember this.
Because I had a couple of the conditions on the new charter merger reversed, but thanks in large part to your excellent dissent. So thank you. But after that, worked as Solicitor General for the state of Utah. So continue to work with consumers. In addition to overseeing appeals, I oversaw the antitrust and data privacy division, and did a fair amount of consumer protection work. So that led to continuing with all of that work protecting consumers to the FTC. And I just am so privileged and honored to be able to work for American consumers every day, protect them against fraudsters, against monopolists. And I'm thrilled to be able to work with the staff. They're so committed, and they just really care deeply about the mission.
Outstanding. Commissioner Symington?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a tough act to follow. When we talk about public service, the question is what public? And those of you who've heard me talk for more than about 10 seconds will probably recognize my strong Canadian accent. I became a U.S. citizen in 2017, at which point I'd already been practicing law in the United States for 6 years. So there's an interesting version for you. But I became a U.S. citizen in 2017, and then in 2020, I was asked to join the last administration, two administrations back, as a political, working on internet policy and telecommunications stuff at NTIA, a great agency. I thought, well, I live in Florida. It's gonna be a schlep back up to DC. I'm gonna be taking a pay cut. Federal government doesn't pay relocation. And what's more, it's the middle of COVID, because I got that offer in the middle of 2020. So nonetheless, you don't get asked twice to do something like that. So we packed up, moved up to DC, and then somehow the ball bounced in an even stranger direction. I wound up on the FCC. As far as what it means to work in public service, I mean, we live in a transformative age with telecommunications. All of us have witnessed the convergence of services. All of us have witnessed the rapid rise and fall of traditional players in the industry, or the different weights that have moved to things. I mean, I think we were all paying attention, for example, when streaming subscriptions outpaced cable subscriptions for the first time in the United States in 2023. But that's just an example of the kind of epochal change that's taking place right now. And as well, we're seeing telecommunications increasingly move away from merely person-to-person and increasingly into machine-to-machine industrial applications. And those are now also at the forefront of national and trade policy. So it's been a fantastic topic to work on. I've always I strive to do it justice. Hard to say with. To the extent to which I succeed, but it's an honor to have the opportunity to try and serve the public trust.
Chairman Pai, you've been out for a little bit and got to see what the outside is. How did you?
I'm back. All right. No, first and foremost, thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly, for convening this panel. Many thanks to Randy May for his kind comments and his many generosities to me over the years, including when I had the privilege of leading the FCC. And thanks to my fellow panelists. Clearly, they are the brains of the operation. I'm just going to be vamping up here for a little bit. But they've obviously elucidated some very good reasons for why they entered public service. For me, it was something a little simpler. Back in the 1980s, I remember when we first got satellite television. I was growing up in a rural part of Kansas. We had the 3 broadcast channels and daily newspaper, a wired phone line into the wall. It's pretty hard to get a vision as a little kid into the outside world. And when we got satellite, the entire world was open to me. And unlike most of my friends, I was one of these dorks who discovered this thing called C-SPAN. And so I'd watch these Senate and House proceedings and President Reagan speaking on the White House lawn and whatnot. And I was transfixed that this was my country. I could finally see the seat of my country. And I'd see Senator Hatch and Senator Kennedy battling it out in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I remember thinking, I only wish something like that could be achieved by someone like me with no connections. None of my family had any governmental experience. None of them were lawyers or policymakers or anything like that. But I just had this burning ambition to someday go to Washington and just visit the buildings. That would be enough for me. And so, obviously, as you know, through a variety of what I've called forced gumping my way through Washington, I ended up in the corner office. And some of my most rewarding experiences in life have been just sharing that experience with my parents who came here in 1971 with $8 and a transistor radio and just a belief that the American dream was possible. And so, obviously, I could go into detail about all the stuff I'm proud of that we did at the FCC together with you, Commissioner Riley, Commissioner Symington, and my other commissioner colleagues. But to me, just being able to share that dream of America with them was just really meaningful. And even now, every now and then, my mom will pull up the picture. I happened to go with the president in February 2020 to India. And there's a picture of me standing on with the prime minister of India on one side, the president on the other. And it's just like only in America could some kid with no connections whatsoever end up in this position. And then she hastens to add, you can still go to medical school to make it all but once an immigrant mom, always an immigrant mom. Anyway, so just the chance to roll up my sleeves and go to work on behalf of the American people, and in a tiny way, not to say that I'm the only one doing this, but just to help vindicate the idea that public service really is a noble calling in America, that you're helping people who may not ever know your name, and that's a pretty cool way, I think, to spend your time.
Okay, so let's dig in a little bit. Commissioner Holyoke, Commissioner Symington, can you explain your current agendas at your agencies? And then are there issues that you personally hope to accomplish during your terms at your respective agencies? Do you want to start, Commissioner Holyoke?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. I think we all heard from Chairman Ferguson this morning, and I agree with him completely that we need to robustly enforce the antitrust laws. And if we don't think there's a violation, we need to get the hell out of the way. Oh, sorry, get the heck out of the way.
Whew.
You guys, you were watching,
we didn't
weren't
beat
you?
you. Yeah.
You were. But to that end, my priorities are like when that are on the competition side, because we both promote competition and protect consumers from consumer protection violations. On the competition side, to really focus on strong cases where we see antitrust violations, to really think about bringing cases where what I've described as a three-legged stool for antitrust litigation, where there's strong testimony and strong documents and strong economic evidence that suggests there's harm there, and to be focusing on that on the consumer protection side. I think we need to absolutely double down on our anti-fraud work. We have recently found out that fraud has increased by 25% last year. So this is billions of more fraud, and we need to really be focusing on that. And I think it's really important to our anti-fraud work as part of a pro-growth agenda, because if you think about it, and I'll give you some examples, when you have new industries coming up like AI, for example, it's a nascent industry, and you have consumers that are going to be interacting with that. They're going to be, if it's riddled with fraud, consumers are going to be hesitant to be working with that new technology. And so we want to relieve that emerging technology from that problem, so that consumers can interact with it and it can flow, innovation can flourish. And so I think that's an important part. Another important part, which I think Chairman Ferguson also mentioned this morning, is really talking about the problems that we have seen that are well known now on deplatforming and silencing users of platforms and social media platforms. And I think that's an important part of what we're doing. We have recently put out an RFI asking consumers about their experiences being deplatformed or silenced on these platforms. And so gathering that information and understanding the harms there and trying to figure out how to address those is going to be an important part of what we do.
Absolutely. So I really like those comments about fraud. Because if there's one thing that Americans don't trust, it's the integrity of their data. And obviously, there are business practices on the trade end that are a factor here, but also there's just the pervasive reality of hacking. All of us have been hacked in some capacity. Sometimes it's identity theft. In fact, I live in Fairfax County. Fairfax County Public Schools had some 30,000 students' identities leaked, which means that I'm now monitoring the credit of my kids the minute they turn 18. Everyone has very, very low expectations about the integrity of their data, and this leads to low expectations about automation and in other words, using data in the world of atoms. If it's not reliable, then that's a problem, and anything wireless is intrinsically an open attack surface. when you think about all the trouble that the Russians had to go to in order to spy on us during the Cold War, I mean, certainly they went to a lot of trouble, right? We all watched The Americans, right? Sometimes it was a matter of spying. Sometimes it was a matter of bugging embassies. In fact, the first recorded use of passive RF was to bug an American embassy. We didn't know how to sweep for bugs like that at that time.
Oh, wow.
It was invented in a scientific research gulag. So there's some history for you in all of its forms. But in any case, they had to go to a lot of trouble to do it because the idea that we would install Soviet-made communications networking equipment pervasively that would chatter back to home base would have seemed, something like between preposterous and treasonous. But in today's open environment, that's not possible, and we have to think about what this means for data integrity and security throughout the telecom system, so that not only do people rely on it, but also so that the industrial applications and public safety applications, logistical applications, medical applications that are all possible right now with current technology but are unsafe to use can become safe to use and can become part of our growth and prosperity as a people. So in furtherance of that, the Commission has adopted a system called the program called the U.S. Cyber Trust Mark. Underwriters Laboratory became the lead manager of this in December. So in that capacity, we're hoping to make it similar to insurance. If you open a pizzeria, you can't buy a non-UL certified pizza oven because your insurer will drop you from coverage, right? And so by those means, we prevent innumerable restaurant fires that otherwise would happen, be a blight on the landscape. Likewise, by getting certified equipment to be the norm and by having real teeth to that certification such that an affected consumer is able to reach back to the vendor, and presumably the vendor can then further reach up through their SLAs. By these means, we hope to achieve real pricing on the drivers of cybersecurity risk, and to make that, and to raise the bar pervasively throughout all civilian applications, which hopefully flows upwards to all applications, period. So that's one thing I'm very excited with working on. And then there's another thing, when Commissioner O'Reilly was on the commission, of course, we heard about all the work he did on process improvements, and we want to take those ideas and run with them. Because when I talked to satellite companies, there was one case where a satellite company I spoke to had been waiting 8 years for a license. That's a really long time. We should be able to improve those processes. The United States has a booming, burgeoning space economy, as it is, we're consumers of about 50% of all world satellite services just here in this one country. We love to buy satellite services in the United States. In some cases, you have agribusiness companies or companies that you wouldn't traditionally think of as agribusiness, but that have built out practices in these areas that are monitoring plants at the individual level optically in order to maximize yield and output. As someone from a farming family, I find that very exciting. So there are all kinds of satellite services going beyond just the communication satellites of the past. There is increasingly industrial activity in space, which I find also very exciting. We wrote the first commercial deep space licenses in Commission history in November of last year. So there are many more applications coming, and the private sector has definitely stepped up and is delivering this. So we have to make sure that the FCC does not become a choke point and a needless drag sail on what the boundless creativity of the American people is yielding up. So those are a couple of my priorities.
Interesting. Chairman Pai, 8 years? No, no, seriously. In your new role in the private sector, are you going to have an opportunity to interact with public officials going forward?
I certainly hope and expect to. That's one of the things that I enjoyed even when I was in office, getting to liaise with my colleagues at the Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, Department of Justice, and within the executive and legislative branches. So I would expect that to continue. And I'm just so impressed with each of the commissioners, how they've really charted a course within their respective agencies. And that's something that I think is really critical for any agency, is to have a very strong bias towards action. Clearly, each of the commissioners reflect that, and I think the agencies overall did. And I'd like to think that our FCC reflected that as well, that you do across the board, from broadband deployment to spectrum to consumer protection, all kinds of different issues. Now, with the benefit of 4 years out of office, I can see, wow, we actually accomplished a lot together, and most of it was bipartisan, and now you're starting to see the cumulative benefits of that across the country. So it's really rewarding when I meet people, some in the industry and some not, just in airports or grocery stores, who stop me like, oh, you're a Jeet Pie, and I'm like, oh God, here we go. But then it's like, oh, you actually did X, Y, or Z, and they can sort of understand now like the kind of logic of what we were doing and why it was important. So I really enjoyed all the work we did together, including with each of you.
Outstanding. So all of us have served in the minority at one point. and we all have going to get opportunity to serve in the majority. And though the FTC and FCC aren't fully to majority status yet, what's it like to be on this side versus the other side? Do you want to start, Commissioner Holyoke?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, we have Mark Metter, who will be joining soon, hopefully. So that will be wonderful to have that addition. So there is a change in that when we have the majority, we can set the priorities of the commission, set the agenda. And I think that can be very important in accomplishing a lot of things. I do hope that we can, and as part of that, fulfilling what we think is President Trump's vision for America, which is a global, America is a global marketplace, and we want to remain at the forefront of innovation in all of these areas, including in some of these emerging technologies. And to do that, we want to have an environment where regulatory and an enforcement environment that sort of gets out of the way, as Chairman Ferguson had mentioned, but allows innovation just to absolutely flourish here. And I think to do that as a commission, we want to make sure that we're providing clear guidance to markets, and so that they can understand the direction that we're taking. This will help in innovation, but I think when we lack clear guidance, when there is a failure to provide clear guidance for the markets, what we see is a depression of investment, and we will see that a depression of innovation, and it's just not good for consumers. It's not good for competition, and so we want to provide that here, and I think we can.
Seventeenth?
Yes, so thank you. Ajit, I'm sure you remember swearing me in. We did it over Teams.
I did, yes.
So it was the depths of COVID, December 2020. I took office on, I think, the 14th. And so I went to the Commerce Department that morning, sent in my resignation letter at about 8:30, turned in my badge, gun, computer, etc. They don't give us guns, no. But I turned in all of my things, and then I turned around, set up my video conference, and got sworn in remotely. I think we won't be seeing too much more of that. So it's
Hopefully.
It's sort of a unique historical moment. So since that was December 2020, I got to serve in the majority for all of about 5 weeks. And at that point, we turned back around, and Ajit followed the customary procedure and resigned on inauguration day, and then we saw we saw ourselves go into minority, or at least the chair pass hands, which at the commission can be almost as effective as going into minority, because the chair gives so much direction to the agency staff. So in other words, I've spent almost all of my time in minority, and in fact have only been those 5 weeks in majority, because the commission has not yet seated a third co-partisan. So as far as what it's like to be in the majority, it's sort of a distant memory. And when it finally happens this time, I'll let you know. But what it was like serving in minority was interesting as well, because since I was the junior member of the minority party, there were no expectations, which is good, because I would have had a hard time fulfilling them. But no, it was good because it let my team start working as a research unit. And what we did is, rather than attempt to litigate fine details of policy, we decided to go out and find what we thought would be driving the bus in the next few years, so that we could be anticipating and not responding. And I think that's where a lot of the issues started to manifest that we discovered. I mean, we took innumerable meetings with startups, for example, which is how we got on some of the specifics in the space beat. Altogether, my team, we went back and compiled our meeting records, and we'd collectively taken 700 meetings in the first 6 months, of which I was personally at about 500. So we just tried to get as much information from the industry as possible to get a full synoptic view that is not just the cable industry perspective, not just the wireless communications, telecommunications perspective, but really as synoptic a view as possible of every FCC regulatee and every second order effect that was being induced by some action at the FCC or some inaction at the FCC. So I think that's the best thing I could have done with my time, because at the FCC, the career staff, you'll meet people who have 30 years of experience in some in some deep corner of telecommunications law, and they might be the world's leading expert on that subject. And the problem is you go over to the next office, and there's someone who's just as deep into some other area of telecommunications law. And after a few minutes, you really start to, of talking to people like this, you really start to feel like you'll never quite match them in their depth. So your only option is to compete on breadth. And, but we were able, I think, on my team to really try to do that and to engage with the broader questions of the increased degree to which telecommunications is moving off of the phone or off of the TV set and into other aspects of our daily lives, particularly with IoT and then with space. So I feel like that was the neat thing to do in the minority, and to anyone else finding themselves in minority, that would be my advice.
Chairman Pai, did you enjoy your days in the minority?
Yes and no. I mean, look, being in the minority is fun in a sense. You get to pick which issues you focus on. You can write a dissent that ultimately finds vindication either in the halls of Congress or in a court. I remember several times when the DC Circuit would reject an FCC decision from which I dissented. You just, it's kind of gratifying to know, like, wow, a court actually saw it my way in terms of the law and the facts, which is pretty nice. But the inability to set the agenda and to constantly be on the losing side of 3-2 votes is not always that pleasant. And I remember very vividly in 2013, at the tail end of Chairman Janikowski's time, he and I would meet periodically, and there's some issue, I can't even remember what it was, but he was saying, you really need to vote this way on it. And I said, well, look, what about this, this, and this? And he said, I was just sort of sitting there like a minority commissioner does, like, you should be doing X, Y, and Z, you should be doing now, and accommodating me on this. And how hard, and I remember saying this, how hard could your job be? You've got 1,500 people at this agency, you set the agenda, you win every time, can't you just throw me a bone? And I just very, very vividly remember Julius sitting there, like, he pointed his finger, he's like, someday you're gonna be in this seat, and you're going to understand how much harder this job is than your current job. I was like, that's ridiculous. I mean, come on, I'm working so hard now. And then I became chair, and suddenly the wisdom came to me that Julius was absolutely right. And I have told Tom Wheeler, that my predecessor, I met with him recently, and I told Tom, like, I don't know how you put up with me when I was a commissioner. It's just a very different, it's a big challenge. And yes, you get to set the agenda, and yes, you get a lot of the acclaim that comes with that, but just managing an agency of that size is really challenging, especially in that political environment is quite challenging. It had major repercussions for me and my family, all sorts of other stuff. And it just, I wouldn't say it was fun to be the chair at that time, but on the other hand, it was enormously rewarding because now with the passage of time, I can get to see a lot, as I mentioned, some of the dividends from our policy decisions finally paying off. But yeah, there are times when I remember my team and I would just, the core team who were there in the beginning, it's like, oh, it's so much easier in the minority when you just, hey, let's write a dissent on this case because we see it a different way. And that was, I mean, gosh, that was our big project for the month, let alone for the day. Whereas as chairman, it's like they're constantly stuff beyond your control, from Hurricane Maria to IT issues. I mean, it's all on your lap, and you have no way around it but to just work your way through it. That was a challenge.
Well, I wouldn't know, but thank you. So there's been a lot of conversation in DC about the independence of the agencies you work at or worked at. Interested in your take on how you see how the FTC and the FCC fit within the overall executive branch. We heard from Chairman Carr and his interest in making sure that he's aligned with the Trump administration and their vision for communication policy. How do you see your role and the tension between the administration and Congress?
That's a great question. And this morning, Chairman Ferguson spoke about this at length, and he described Humphrey's executor. And I agree with everything that with all of his explanation on all of this, and that all of the power of the executive is with President Trump. And President Trump lawfully exercised his constitutional authority in removing Commissioners Slaughter and Bedoya. And so I just want to clarify my last question when we were talking about majority, looking forward to Mark Metter joining the commission. I did not mean to suggest that we could not proceed as a commission now with Chairman Ferguson and me, with just two commissioners at the commission. We can, and as Chairman Ferguson described, I absolutely agree with him on that. With all of that in mind, we have a very important mission at the commission. And as I've talked about, we need to protect the American consumers. That mission is critical. It's also very urgent, as I've described, with the fraud and with what we are expecting. There's been some forecasted a lot of M&A activity coming up, so we have a very important and urgent mission coming up, and we will continue to do that. And we will continue, and the job for me remains the same. I will approach this job and looking if I have reason to believe that there's been a violation of the antitrust laws, of consumer protection laws, then I will proceed to support those enforcement efforts.
Mr. Symington, any thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to find out if Humphrey's executor is good law, and right now only the Supreme Court knows for sure. But I guess the language in it is interesting, right? Quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial, and the question that comes to me reading that language is, what's the significance of quasi in there? Is it perhaps the fact that these agencies have started to slide a little bit into being actually legislative, actually judicial? I mean, that's certainly one way to read the implications of Jarkessi. As saying that we were actually acting as a court increasingly at administrative agencies, and had sort of arrogated to ourselves that power, whether that's an independent regulatory agency or not. And so asking about what the contours of power should be like, asking the simple question, what article are you under exactly? Should absolutely be part of how we justify our continued existence at these independent regulatory agencies. As far as the outcome of the case, I have to admit, before Jarkessi came out, I was not thinking all that much about the 7th Amendment as an FCC lawyer, but it turns out to be enormously significant, I think, for how we act. And it may be that there were simply constitutional norms that no one had really thought about for a long time, but that actually wind up being fundamental to how we do business, and that we were in fact trespassing on them for some period of time. So it's always, I think, good to remember that we serve the American people, and that means that we have to uphold the rights of the American people, and that's where all the justification for what we do comes from. And I think that's what the coming cases are going to demonstrate.
Chairman Pai, you lived at a different time, and are you intrigued by how things have developed?
It's been fascinating. I remember reading Humphrey's executor as a law student, and it didn't quite make sense to me because, following up on Myers and some of the other cases that preceded. And so there were a number of cases like that when I was in school. And just always I wondered why, but that's just the way it developed. And when I was in office, obviously, it was a somewhat different time, as you mentioned. In some ways, this issue is pretty simple. I mean, you ask any general consumer of Schoolhouse Rock how many branches of government there are. They'll tell you 3, right? Like legislative, executive, and judicial. And so it seems to follow, as Commissioner Symington was saying, like the FCC has got to be one of them, and the FTC has to be one of them. And it seems pretty clearly to be within the executive branch. On the other hand, obviously, there's a complicated body of law that's grown up along with some of the practical precedents along with it. So I'll be curious to see what the court does. I will simply say, for my part, I always tried to call the balls and strikes as I saw them, and sometimes that was consistent with the White House's goals, and the White House was actually helpful. Things like 5G, for example, we couldn't have done it without a cross-agency effort, led in part by the White House. So, we'll see where it shakes out, but it's certainly something that has generated all these constitutional debates that have been lingering in my own mind since the 1990s.
So, with that in mind, do we need 2 reviews of merger applications? So you have 2 agencies that review merger applications?
I'll take it if you guys don't want to.
Go. No, yeah.
Absolutely not. No, I started my career in Washington in the honors program at the Department of Justice in the Antitrust Division. I remember very early on, the Telecom Task Force, lost a merger review to the FTC. And I remember asking my boss at the time, what does that mean? How do we lose something? And apparently there was a room where the relevant FTC official and relevant DOJ official would sit in and hash out, okay, you get this one, I get that one. It never made sense to me why we had duplicative reviews, one of which was within the Department of Justice, clearly within the executive branch, the other one with the FTC, obviously multi-member independent agency with a different standard of review. I mean, just this weird residue, it seemed to me at the time of the New Deal. And to me, it's only become clearer over time that we should have a singular antitrust authority Sorry, I mean, I don't mean to take away a job from you today.
As long as
but,
it becomes effective in like a couple of years.
Yeah, no, it's like sort of like exactly, like the 27th Amendment
Yeah,
being effective after the next election. So, but similarly, the FCC on top of that has its own layer of review with an amorphous public interest standard, which is elastic depending on whatever the majority at the time happens to think it is. So I honestly think, especially now in my current role, getting to see how much you have to think through the regulatory review process, and that's not even including Team Telecom and CFIUS and all the rest of it. It's just incredibly complicated, and I think it would be helpful for everybody, especially the American public, to have a single standard of review administered by a single agency based on criteria that are open and published and transparent and understandable and consistent with basic economics. And I don't think in the 21st century that's too much to ask.
I think the single standard review, that absolutely makes sense to me. But there are some arguments for whether, is it redundancy, or is some of this overlap help to miss some really problematic mergers that will, and by finding those and by challenging those, can really help consumers. But I think also just to think of the FTC, and Chairman Ferguson talked a lot about this morning, as having a very interesting kind of distinctive mandate as it looks at both competition and consumer protection. Having both of those kind of issues can really help inform each other as we're looking at these cases. And particularly as I'm looking at, like, for example, a consumer protection enforcement action, it is right in my mind as I'm thinking, okay, if we do something there, how is this going to impact the market and competition in that respect? But we also have the ability to do a lot of expert studies and whatnot, and having both of those mandates can really inform those as well.
Mr. Simonton, any thoughts? You want to give away authority, or you want to take it all?
Well, the public interest standard is an interesting one, because people who have a background in antitrust are often a little surprised at how hard it can be to call the likely outcome of FCC merger review. And then adding to the complexity, of course, is that FCC jurisdiction comes from medium, like the medium truly is the message. And so as such, people in the general public, and even the informed general public, the investing public or something, are often surprised by the degree to which the medium of transmission winds up being determinative of whether or not something is in the public interest. Adding to this, Congress has often had different points of view on this at different times, and so there could be perfectly good law that is nonetheless very restrictive to one industrial business category while being very open to another, thus leading to a structural advantage in capital allocation and capital entry for the less regulated business type. You put it all together, and it's hard to argue that the FCC's public interest standard is either predictable or a timeless, perfect, finished piece of perpetual wisdom. I think we definitely need to be asking ourselves to what degree should the public interest standard be an unpredictable encumbrance on a forward-looking basis. And what is the public interest, in fact, that we're trying to vindicate, and can that be articulated in a clear way to people other than, the FCBA lifers?
Commissioner Howell, the FTC has a more clear-cut structure and a statutory regime to follow, and if if applicants don't like it, you can sue if they try to move forward, notwithstanding. And Chairman Pai is talking about clear-cut rules, and Commissioner Simonton makes a compelling case of why the public interest. Where do you fall on all the differences between the agencies reviewing a merger that only differs based on the technology they offer?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I think that companies who might find themselves, and this is for us, we have the FTC and DOJ overlap, find themselves in that clearance process, might be trying to figure out why do I get a different standard? And I agree completely. The standard review, I do think, and I've spoken about this before, should be the same. From a pragmatic standpoint, I really don't think it's going to make much difference in our enforcement efforts. And I think we can go into court and still win our cases based on our strong cases. We have fantastic staff that are absolutely up for the task to fight those cases. But these are, tough questions, and ultimately, and I know this morning talked a little bit about the One Agency Act and where that goes, and it's ultimately a question for Congress to decide.
Okay. So switch a little bit. Where do you think that the applicants deserve a final decision so they can challenge it? I know there's an instance in the last administration where the applicant just lingered and then went to the ALJ, and it lingered there, and I think there was some concern about that. Do applicants deserve kind of a due date or a drop dead date to be able to make either move forward or not move forward or something of that nature? Do all you have thoughts on that?
Go ahead.
I'm
sorry.
going to just jump in
Yeah.
on this one because I'm of course, this is an FCC case that we're talking about here.
Oh.
This is.
Well, it sounds like an FTC
Yeah,
case.
exactly. I was just going to say, yeah, you could probably think of it either way. Well,
Yeah.
look, I made my view clear that we should be able to do a satellite license in fewer than 8 years, right? And it's also probably true that we shouldn't, that there shouldn't be any rubric of suspicion that a telecom deal has potentially been killed by allowing the financing to expire while it was under an ALJ. It's one of these things where it's, of course, impossible to determine with a total degree of certainty what's happened, but it calls the credibility of the process into question at minimum. So the FCC has made, I think, great strides whenever it's worked to increase certainty. I don't think it's very easy to point to abusable bright line certainty at the FCC, whereas it is possible to point at process vagueness causing a deadweight loss. So I think I would say that we should be on the road towards more clarity, more certainty, and brighter lines. And if at some point that becomes a problem, we can readdress. But I think we've got a long way to correct before we get to that point.
That aligned with what you're thinking, Chairman Pai?
Yeah, generally it does. I mean, look, I said this when I was in office. I think applicants have a right to say, tell me yes, tell me no, but tell me something within a time specific. And that was one of the things that drove me crazy as a commissioner. Like, why are we sitting on a lot of these things that have been around for years, in some cases since the Bush administration in the early 2000s? And that's why, well beyond the merger review process, when it came to spectrum issues that had been sitting around since 2003, or all kinds of other issues, we always tried to take action, even if we knew that this was going to cause some opposition. I mean, there are a lot of 55-45 issues in telecom, and it's very easy as a chairman or a commissioner to say, you know what, let's just punt that to the next administration. Let that be someone else's problem. And ultimately, I don't think that's not public service. To me, that's the abdication of public service. You're called to these positions to make difficult decisions, even when it means you're going to be criticized. And so, yeah, I remember in the summer of 2020 when an article came out, Ajit Pai is making powerful enemies on the road to 5G, and it ticked through the Department of Defense and FAA and NASA and NOAA. And I remember my mom, who had a Google News alert for my name unhelpfully, like, oh my God, what's going on? All these powerful people, some who wear uniforms, are mad at you. And I had to go through and explain, we're making these decisions because it's ultimately the right thing for the American people. And it would be easy for me to not broach my mom's chagrin or the American public chagrin by just kicking it to the can down to the next administration, but that's not what I was willing to do. So again, I think every agency should have an orientation towards action. People in the private sector deserve certainty, whether they're operators, investors, public interest groups, whatever. If they've asked you to make a decision and explain why you made the decision in a transparent way. And I think ultimately everyone is better off for that, even if you ultimately get criticized.
So both agencies.
I would say ours, we're a little bit differently situated.
Yeah, no, please, absolutely.
Oh, sure. I think historically, the FTC, if we have a merger before us, we will either sue to block or we won't, and we don't issue these approvals. But I think the market understands that, and the market, they when they're coming up with their deals and their merger agreements, they work into timelines, and it's slightly different because of HSR and understanding that. So I think from the FTC's perspective, if we added, some sort of approval process, it would likely just add a layer of regulatory transaction costs that is probably unnecessary.
So both agencies not only have to work with other parts of the executive branch, but also deal with international settings. And you have conferences and negotiations. How do you view the role of the agency in those situations? And I think in the past there were, I've laid some criticisms of how the last administration handled the interactions of FTC matters internationally. I think FCC is preparing to come forward with WRC, and we have some different problems for spectrum and globalization and harmonization for trying to find, agreement with countries like China and Russia, Iran. Very interesting dynamic in the ITU. How did you interact with the U.S. leadership, and what did you think of that process, or how do you think of that process overall?
I'd be happy to start unless.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think it's incredibly important for these agencies to liaise with their counterparts across the U.S. government and present, either in a bilateral or multilateral basis, a very consistent view of what the American interest is. I mean, spectrum is the easiest example. In the lead up to WRC 2019, it wasn't just a delegation one day deciding to fly to the Middle East. I mean, it was a series of very extensive meetings in the 2 years or so leading up to it, which helped us build a foundation for action on some spectrum bands that allowed us to get harmonized spectrum, which is obviously critical for our companies and our innovators here in the United States. That takes a lot of time. I mean, I'm sure you've both found it as well. I mean, it's not easy. There are no discernible KPIs for progress. But you know if you don't do it, the price is going to be inaction. And so I think it's really important for agency officials, chairs, commissioners, et cetera, to work with their counterparts in other countries. We had to build MOUs or other understandings and relationships that will help you advance the ball, and in a multilateral way, just work as collaboratively as you can within the relevant entities to achieve progress. It's not going to be easy, and now, Mike, you know better than most, you've had a lot to say about the ITU process and how it works or doesn't work. I think it's going to be interesting to see in the next couple of years how that develops, given some of the geopolitical changes we've seen.
No, I absolutely agree. Having the relationship, being able to make sure you have, and we do have a close relationship with USTR, Department of State, others, and making sure we have a clear and message across the government. And we've seen this. We've seen President Trump and Vice President Vance speak to officials, foreign officials, about competition policies and how we view those issues.
Any thoughts, Commissioner?
Yeah, so the FCC doesn't have a foreign policy of its own, but we do have a view of, I think, what's right for the American people. And I think it's very important for us to keep the connections open with particularly with the State Department, but generally with all the agencies of the U.S. government in order to get good results. To pick something actually from your tenure, Ajit, at work in 2019, one of the headline issues from my perspective was liberalization for solid-state beamforming eSIMs, which
Wow, somebody remembers. That's great. I'm thrilled.
Anytime anyone drives cross-country with a Starlink box, that's an example of that kind of liberalization. And it was a recognition that we had moved from a world of primarily large parabolic antennas to a world where increasingly you could use small solid-state arrays of antennas to make your connections, including on mobile vehicles. So, I'm using sort of a slightly frivolous, although fun example of a Starlink on an RV, but obviously any kind of a moving array antenna is an example of this kind of thing. So that's the kind of maybe individually unglamorous, but cumulatively enormously influential thing that happens at these conferences. Once you have harmonized rules on this, all of a sudden hundreds of millions of people the world over can access a different tier of service. Commercial investors become convinced that generally this is a service type and category that will be adoptable and saleable worldwide, and that's to a market of billions of people. And so getting it right is extremely difficult. But it's also vitally important, and I think it's actually a core. Certainly in the case of us at the FCC, it's a core responsibility that we really understand how to plan with about 2 years lead time, I would say, for the big international conferences in our areas. Yeah. They wind up having huge knock-on effects.
By the way, the other piece of it, which, not to add to the answer, but the other piece of it, which may be unique to the FCC, I don't know if the FTC has something similar, but I just want to give a shout out to USTTI, which has done fantastic work over the years. The late Ambassador Gardner, who pioneered the idea during the Reagan administration, bringing in regulators, communications regulators from around the world to help them understand how the American policy framework operated and to help them replicate it in their own countries. And I'm forever grateful to Mickey, to Jim, everybody at the USTTI for working with the FCC as a partner. That's the kind of thing which I guess you might call it soft power, but to me it had really hard advantages over time. Once thousands of regulators go through this process and understand how we do things, it just makes things a lot easier when you have a lot of these conversations that we've just discussed.
Makes sense.
So one of the hotter topics in policy is artificial intelligence, AI. Can you share your thoughts on whether your agencies have authority, and does government need to impose some limitations? And if so, what are your thoughts? Is that wide open enough?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, sure, I'll field that one. So the FCC is just to set the stage for people who are not professional FCC with a professional FCC focus. The FCC is about 1,600 people. That's to regulate the entire telecom industry in the United States, whether that's broadcast TV, whether that's cable, whether that's wireless mobility, whether that's phone lines, whether that's satellites, whether that's radars, just a huge amount of stuff. And one of the things that's a little bit unique about us and a little different in the age of DOGE is that we are regulatory fee funded rather than appropriations funded. In the main, sometimes we can get appropriations if there's a big extra job that Congress has tasked us with, and Ajit knows what I'm talking about. But in the main, we're regulatory fee funded, so that means that we're structurally capped at how we want to grow unless we can make an argument for why the industry should be paying more for its own, for the benefits of its own regulation. So where this puts us in the age of cybersecurity is a little bit of a tough question, because we want to do things in this, perhaps, in order to fulfill our statutory mandate, but it's not clear which Peter is going to be robbed to pay that Paul. And it's a little bit the same thing with AI. Insofar as the FCC has a point of view about AI, I think we should be primarily a taker and not a maker in having that point of view. We may have our own specific experiences that are arising from the cases that we're dealing with or from issues brought in by our regulatees. But in the main, we don't have the technical expertise or the research depth within the organization to be formulating AI policy as a prime actor. There are areas where it's likely to come up. Probably a lot of people are hearing about 6G. There's probably going to be an AI element in allocating frequencies and transmission pathways for 6G whenever we have a standard for it, which we don't. So far, 6G is a notion and not a thing. But in any case, that's the kind of thing where there will likely be AI applications for a highly important regulated technology in the future. And to that extent, the FCC will have to have a point of view about AI. Otherwise, I think we should butt out.
I like that. Stay the heck out of the way. But I think the same for the FTC in terms of this is an area that we're obviously paying great attention to, and I think we have. It's critical that we understand what's happening here, that we understand the markets and the players, and we are. We just recently released a 6B study that talks about this and talks about some of the market participants. And the reason why is because the structure of this market, as we're looking at it, I mean, it's got very high entry costs, right? And there's going to be lots of network effects. So that is an area where we're going to be really paying close attention and ensuring that, and pay close attention to potential harms for understanding if there might be potential competition concerns there. It's something that we can do. On the consumer protection side, of course, I think we should be using our laws that we have now, and we can and we have. We have had a suite of cases. We had a sweep last fall called AI Comply, where we looked at areas where folks were using AI in different fraud scenarios. Some of them are where they were making misrepresentations of the power of some sort of tool that was they claimed it was powered by AI, and it wasn't. And so you'll see some of that. But we'll see. I think we need to remain absolutely vigilant on both the competition side and on the fraud side, and we'll see AI sort of touch in many respects. But make sure, as far as innovation goes, and that we're just getting the heck out of the way.
Taker, not a maker. Jeet, what do you think about AI?
I think both of my colleagues on the panel have explained very well the lay of the land from their respective agencies. Just putting on my investor hat, I guess what I would say is two things at a very high level. One is something that I hope the United States does not do, and one that I think it must do. The thing not to do, I think, is to apply what might broadly be called the precautionary principle to AI. I do not want to have a situation where the ability to innovate in the United States is dependent on the say-so of a government official, that you have to run your model through some agency where some bureaucrat is going to sit there and try to decide, based on expertise he or she doesn't really have, what to do. That's, I think, very dangerous to innovation. But the thing that, I think that goes without saying, the thing that I think we absolutely must do, and it's going to sound very mundane, we need power in this country. And I see it all the time in all of these investments that we're looking at. Like a data center, for example, the critical input is not necessarily getting the relevant real estate approvals or whatever. It's getting power, and a massive amount of power, to that data center. The loads that are going to be required for these data centers to operate once AI really starts to scale, it's going to be enormous, magnitudes of what we have today. It's exceptionally difficult to build anything in the United States today. It's very hard to get electric utilities visibility into how they're going to supply 1 gigawatt or more to some of these data centers that are required for AI to pop. And I worry as a country, forget about just as an investor, or as a data center person, or AI enthusiast, that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, compared to where China is in terms of power development, we're going to be significantly behind if we don't move quickly. And so I'm thrilled to see that the Energy Secretary has been in the center of this in the private sector, and now he's going to apply his expertise in the public sector. This is one of the, and it has all these secondary effects as well. It helps drive down inflation because it makes things cheaper to produce and get to market, et cetera. But I think power is one of the unheralded saviors of the telecom sector, the technology sector that we just don't talk enough about in this town.
Well, we can all turn into energy practitioners. So, well,
Yeah, I wish I were.
with that, I think our panel is coming to an end. I want to thank everyone. Please thank my panelists.
Stay there.
1 minute.
Yeah, no, you are coming to an end, but I want to thank Mike as well and the panel. You know, we've been doing, this is our 17th annual conference, and we're also live streaming it as well. So there are people over in Asia, Africa, I'm sure, watching us too. But we've never had so many people stay for so long, really, and it's a tribute, of course, to the panel. Now, I don't want you to tell any of the earlier speakers this, but I only had 5 Free State Foundation caps left in my inventory.
No mugs.
That's a hint to Laurie that we need to order some more. But in appreciation of your being here and assuming it's consistent with all the rules, you know, these really don't cost that much. They're pretty cheap. I want to give you a Free State Foundation cap.
Getting a gift
and
is cheap.
Join me once more in thanking this panel, please.
No, thanks.